a moment on what seemed like an ordinary flight, and then a single slap brought the entire cabin to silence. But what happened next? No one saw it coming. Welcome to the channel, where we share real, powerful, and inspiring stories every single day. If this is your first time watching, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so you never miss another journey. Now, get ready to witness the breathtaking events of today's story. The sound cracked like lightning, slicing through the pressurized air of Flight 2687's passenger cabin. In that moment, the crowded cabin plunged into a silence so thick it strangled breath. The rustle of newspapers, the roll of luggage, the click of soda cans opening. Everything vanished in an instant. Elijah Moore, a 16-year-old black teenager, looked up, his eyes wide in stunned disbelief. His left cheek flared red, as if scalded, and before pain could even register, shame coursed through his body like a jolt of electricity. Beside him, Richard Whitmore, a white man in his 50s clad in a sleek gray suit and neatly combed hair, was still panting. His face flushed crimson, and his hand remained suspended midair, as if the echo of the slap still hadn't faded. "I told you," Richard hissed through clenched teeth, his words venomous. "Know your place, boy." The cabin froze. A few passengers covered their mouths. A couple phones quietly lit up as cameras began to roll. Flight attendants rushed in from both ends of the aisle, their faces a mix of shock and tightening professionalism. For 3 seconds, long, unblinking seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire plane hung in suspension, 36,000 feet above the earth, held hostage by one single moment. And Elijah, he didn't swing back. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply stared at Richard, his eyes holding back a storm the size of an ocean. He sat up straight, pulled the earbuds from his ears, and slowly lifted his chin. "What did I do to you?" he asked, voice hoarse, not angry, just trying to understand. No one answered. Even Richard stepped back half a pace, as though he himself couldn't believe the force of what he'd just done. But the look in his eyes, arrogant and furious, never left Elijah. The air in the cabin fractured like shards of glass, revealing the naked truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an act of intent. The lead flight attendant, Naomi Carter, appeared almost instantly, her poised expression cracked by a flicker of alarm. "Sir," she said, voice wrapped in forced calm, "please step back." Everyone remained seated. From a few rows back, a man stood abruptly, gray hair, lean frame, eyes too calm to be harmless. Samuel Novak. "Not this time," he said, enunciating every word, his voice laced with the hard edges of a European accent, unlike the times in his life when he had stayed quiet in the face of injustice. Today, he would not look away. All eyes shifted to him, a man who looked ordinary in every sense, but within seconds, the dynamic changed. He stepped forward, placed himself between Elijah and Richard, and stood still, like a wall. No one could have known that in that single moment, not only would Flight 2687 change course, but the lives of these three strangers, now intersected, would never return to what they were. Samuel Novak stood tall, casting a long shadow under the pale cabin lights of the aircraft. The cold air from the ventilation system still blew steadily, but the atmosphere had thickened, dense, electric. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He simply stood there, between a struck boy and the man who had struck him. "Elijah, are you all right?" Samuel asked, tilting his head, though his eyes never left Richard Whitmore. The boy gave a small nod, his lips pressed tight. Elijah's shoulders trembled, not from fear, but from holding back. In his tear-glossed eyes, he clung fiercely to his dignity, not crying, not collapsing. Samuel saw it all. Richard let out a scoffing laugh, his voice low and condescending. "What do you think you're doing, old man? Can't you see that little punk had it coming?" Someone in the cabin exhaled sharply, maybe from the back. A few passengers began recording, their hands trembling. Others, mostly younger, shifted from stunned silence to quiet outrage. But no one moved, no one acted, until Samuel spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it rang through the cabin like a bronze bell. I've lived through a war, Mr. Whitmore. I know what violence looks like. And I know the most dangerous thing in the world isn't bullets or bombs. It's silence in the face of cruelty. His gaze stayed locked on Richard, unflinching. I was silent once, when I should have spoken. I've carried that weight for 40 years. But not this time. Richard narrowed his eyes, lips drawn in a tight sneer, as if sizing up an opponent. And who the hell are you supposed to be? Some nosy old man? This is between me and him. No, Samuel cut in, his voice steady. This is between you and every person who's ever been treated like that boy, just because of the color of their skin. Naomi Carter stepped in now, voice firm but still wrapped in the required civility of her job. We'll be informing the captain and ground security the moment we land. I ask everyone to remain calm. Please, return to your seats and maintain distance. Richard stepped back half a pace, the fire in his eyes flickering like a flame splashed with cold water. He understood this was no longer a one-sided act of domination. This wasn't a lone teenager being cornered. Now, the cabin was watching, judging, and standing between him and the boy was Samuel Novak, a man bent with age but unshaken, like a pillar of justice suspended in the sky. Elijah looked at him. For the first time, his eyes softened, quietly meeting the gaze of the stranger who had stepped in. Thank you, the boy whispered, barely audible. Samuel nodded. Don't mention it, son. But remember this, you did nothing wrong. You don't ever have to shrink to make someone else comfortable. And the cabin, though still hushed, had begun to breathe again. Elijah had barely drawn a breath when beside him, Aria Delgado shot up like a spring finally released after being compressed too long. Oh no. Nope. That's it, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. I've kept my mouth shut this whole flight, but this I'm not letting slide. The 17-year-old girl, with her high ponytail, worn silver Converse, and a hoodie bearing the logo of a San Diego punk band, now looked like a compact warrior sprung from a backstage rehearsal. Only her eyes said this was no performance. You, trash bag, she snapped, pointing directly at Richard Whitmore, who was still trying to maintain his composure while the rest of the cabin remained frozen. You just slapped a teenager and thought you could sit there like nothing happened? What? Waiting for round two. A few murmurs rippled through the cabin. The plane was cruising at 36,000 feet, but the air felt like it had fallen out of orbit. Aria turned to the hesitant passengers. I don't care where you're from or where you're going, but if you think that slap was normal, ask yourself, what if it had been your son? A woman a few rows back nodded slowly. A man holding a toddler in his arms stared at Aria, his lips pressed tight in contemplation. She'd hit a nerve, and she knew it. Elijah looked up at her, eyes wide. He had never seen anyone react like that on his behalf. Not friends at school. Definitely not adults. But this stranger, the girl whose name he'd only learned a few hours earlier after being seated next to her, had leapt up like she was defending family. You okay? Aria asked, her voice softening immediately as she leaned toward him. Elijah nodded. Thanks. She smiled, but her eyes never left Richard. If that guy says one more word, I'm live streaming him on TikTok in 10 seconds. I've got 80K followers, and I swear he'll be a meme by tomorrow morning. No need, Samuel interjected, his voice low with a hint of a grin. I think he's starting to get the message. Well, if not, I still have Wi-Fi. Aria shrugged and sat down, but her eyes stayed alert, like a stray cat guarding a doorstep. A few moments later, lead flight attendant Naomi Carter returned, this time with a broad-shouldered man in a black uniform, likely the co-pilot or an air marshal. He nodded to Samuel, then spoke quietly with Naomi. Both of them turned their gaze toward Richard. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. No longer tight with silent tension, the cabin now hummed with something quieter but stronger, a shared current of unspoken solidarity between strangers. Elijah felt something new, not quite safety, not yet justice, but for the first time he knew that, up here in the sky or down on the ground, he wasn't alone anymore. Naomi Carter moved briskly down the aisle, her eyes as sharp as blades sweeping across each row. In over a decade as a flight attendant, she'd seen her share of chaos in skies, from drunk passengers to midair childbirths. But she had never witnessed a young black teen get slapped in full view by a white passenger, and all of it unfold midair in front of more than 200 witnesses. Beside her walked Eric Johnson, her tall, composed colleague whose calm demeanor masked the storm brewing in his eyes. "Richard Whitmore, right?" Eric asked quietly. Naomi nodded. "Seat 16C. Assault on a minor passenger. And we got at least 5 people ready to testify." Eric glanced toward Richard, the man now trying to feign innocence, though his hand still trembled, whether from anger or fear. He stuffed a tablet into his leather briefcase, as if preparing for a business meeting rather than facing the fallout of a violent act. Naomi stepped up to Elijah and Arya, bending slightly. "Elijah, I'm Naomi, the lead flight attendant. Are you okay?" Elijah gave a small nod. His eyes still shimmered with shock, but there was no fear. Arya leaned toward Naomi. "You know, if that silver-haired guy hadn't stood up, they might have blamed Elijah. That guy didn't just slap him. He tried to flip the whole situation." Naomi gave a subtle nod. "I saw almost everything. And this flight won't end the way he thinks it will." Then a woman rose from a row up front, mid-40s, neatly styled brown hair, thin frame glasses, holding a small digital camera, the kind usually used for family vacations. But today, it held something far more valuable. "I recorded the whole thing," she announced, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "The slap and everything he said before it. If this boy needs evidence, I'm willing to provide it." A current swept through the cabin. A lone clap from the rear, then another, and soon applause rippled like waves down the aisles. Arya spun around and shouted, "Ma'am, you are the queen of this plane." Naomi approached the woman, polite but firm. "I'm the lead flight attendant. If possible, I'd like to back up your video to our system, so we can submit it to airport authorities upon landing." "Absolutely," the woman replied, her voice steady and resolute. "We can't let something like this get brushed aside." In that moment, the airplane was no longer just a vessel suspended in the cold, indifferent sky. It had become an impromptu courtroom of justice, where everyone, from teenage girls, veterans, flight attendants to everyday moms, played their part as witnesses to the truth. Eric made his way to Richard Whitmore. His tone remained professional, but his resolve was unmistakable. "Mr. Whitmore, for the safety of this flight, I need to inform you that airport security will be meeting you upon landing. We expect your full cooperation." Richard turned pale. For the first time, he was completely silent. The flight continued. But from that moment on, everyone knew the truth couldn't be buried in a sealed cabin 36,000 feet above the ground. After several tense final hours, Flight 2687 touched down at Havenport International Airport beneath the fading afternoon light. As the cabin door swung open, humid air and the sharp-scented jet fuel rushed in. Yet nothing could clear the stifling atmosphere still hanging from the moment Richard Whitmore's hand had struck. Elijah stepped off the plane with a quiet face, saying nothing. Beside him walked Arya and Samuel, followed closely by lead flight attendant Naomi Carter and 2 airport police officers, escorting Richard from behind. The slap was over, but its ripple had only begun. Havenport International buzzed with its usual noise and movement. But for Elijah Moore, everything passed by in a thick, blurred haze. Now he sat in a private waiting room next to his father, Dr. Kenneth Moore, a renowned thoracic surgeon from Oak Ridge. The tall, composed doctor in his 50s was usually calm and gentle, but his face now showed a tightly reined fury. In his hand, his phone screen glowed. The video of Richard Whitmore's slap had gone viral, crossing over 1 million views in just a few hours. Elijah glanced at the clip again, then turned away. "I don't want to see it anymore, Dad." Kenneth set the phone down and nodded. "No one wants to watch themselves being humiliated, but you have to face this. Elijah, the airport police want to know, do you want to press charges against him?" The door opened. Naomi Carter stepped inside, accompanied by a uniformed officer in crisp black, Lieutenant Renee Harris, according to her name tag. "We've taken statements from witnesses. The video is very clear," Lieutenant Harris said. "Richard Whitmore is being held in airport security. The boy has the right to press charges for physical assault against a minor." The room fell into a brief silence. Elijah stared at his hand, still red from the impact, then looked up, eyes quiet but deep, before speaking. He turned to his father. Dr. Kenneth Moore placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I can't decide for you," he said, his voice low and full of care. "But if you choose to speak out, not for revenge, but to draw a clear line between right and wrong, I'll be with you every step of the way." He paused and added, "Justice doesn't always come from courtroom, but silence sometimes feeds the worst parts of this world. You ever ask yourself, if you do nothing, will you regret it later?" Naomi sat beside Elijah. "You're not alone, but you're also not being pushed into anything. Whatever you choose, it's yours." "I'm not afraid of him," Elijah said slowly. "I'm just afraid that if I don't do anything, someone else will have to go through it next." Lieutenant Harris nodded. "If you choose to press charges, we'll support you through the legal process. But be prepared. Reporters are already circling. There may be press waiting outside." Just as she finished, Naomi's phone rang. She stepped out to answer it and returned a few minutes later, her expression subtly surprised. "Elijah, someone wants to speak with you. A witness. He said you need to hear this before making your final decision." A moment later, Samuel Novak, the 66-year-old veteran who stood up to Richard, entered the room with his usual calm presence. In his hand was a brown envelope. "Elijah," he said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Inside, here's a letter I wrote to the authorities 3 years ago. It was a report about a similar incident, but no one responded. I've stayed silent too long. If you decide to act, I'll walk beside you." Elijah opened the envelope, scanning the bold, steady handwriting. It was a formal complaint about an assault on a subway train in Houston, involving a white man attacking a young black boy. In that moment, beneath the sterile airport lights and with chaos waiting just beyond the doors, clarity came over Elijah like sunrise through fog. He looked up at everyone in the room, then nodded. "I'm pressing charges." His words rang out like a bell in a quiet station, not loud but final, and it marked the beginning of a battle. He now knew he wouldn't have to fight alone. As the golden hue of sunset streamed across the cold stone floor of Havenport Terminal, Elijah sat silently beside Samuel on a hard plastic bench. Crowds flowed past in hurried streams, but between them settled a heavy, contemplative stillness. "You holding up okay?" Elijah asked after a long pause, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and unprocessed emotion. Samuel turned to the boy, eyes distant. He gave a slow nod, resting a hand on the wooden cane beside his foot. "There's something. I think it's time I told you." Elijah turned to him, tilting his head, confused. Samuel drew in a deep breath. "Have you ever heard the name James Moore? Sergeant, U.S. Marines. Vietnam, 1971. Elijah froze. "James Moore was my grandfather. He died when I was 8. Samuel nodded softly, emotion flickering in his eyes. "I was a volunteer medic. We were ambushed near Quang Tri. I was badly injured, left for dead. But James, your grandfather, risked everything to save me. Pulled me out of the crossfire, patched me up, carried me 2 miles through jungle back to base. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here." Elijah stared at him, wide-eyed. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because I stayed silent when I shouldn't have," Samuel said, his voice low and steady. "I swore I'd find him after the war, to thank him. But when I got back, life swept me away. I was afraid he'd be angry I'd disappeared, that I'd waited too long. And I've carried that regret for 45 years. Then Samuel slid a photograph across the bench toward Elijah. In the picture were 2 young soldiers, one black, one white, standing under a bleak sky, arms slung around each other's shoulders, their smiles etched with both fear and defiance. "The one on the left is your grandfather," Samuel said. "He saved my life in Vietnam, 1971. But I never told anyone until today." Elijah stared at the photo, his hand trembling slightly. He wasn't sure what moved him more, the truth about his grandfather or the sincerity in the eyes of the man who had carried this secret for nearly half a century. Then Elijah looked at the older man, someone who, just hours earlier, had been a total stranger, and now, somehow, felt like a thread connecting him to a history he'd never known. "You looked for me because of my grandfather?" he whispered. Samuel nodded. "When I saw you on that plane, silent, composed, I recognized it. Not just the face, but the spirit. You carried the same presence he had." And when Richard raised his hand, I knew I couldn't stay silent again. There was a brief pause before Elijah asked, "It were my grandfather, what would he have done?" Samuel offered a faint smile. He would have stood up, not with fists, with dignity. "I'm not sure why life brought all this together," Elijah murmured, "but maybe it's so we can finally begin to heal." Samuel nodded. "That slap didn't just land on you. It struck a whole chain of history we've never dared to face. But standing up for each other, even late, is still right on time." Elijah smiled, a quiet smile, like someone who had just reclaimed a lost piece of their story. And in that moment, they both knew their connection was more than a chance encounter on a flight. It was a bridge between past and present, between regret and redemption. The air between them seemed to warm amidst the impersonal buzz of the terminal. Then a chime from Elijah's phone broke the stillness. It was a message from Aria Delgado, letting him know the media was closing in and his story was spreading fast across social media. "You're becoming the center of it all now," Samuel said as he rose. "But before the world calls you a victim or a hero, you need to remember you're Elijah Moore. Don't let anyone else write your story but you." Elijah clenched his fists, not in anger, but with resolve. For the first time, he felt the weight on his shoulders wasn't his alone. It belonged to a legacy, to decades of silence that one man had carried, and now he had chosen to break. Elijah and Samuel stood before the tall glass windows of Terminal L, golden evening light pouring through and casting long beams across the polished floor. Outside, planes rose and landed in endless rhythm. But inside them, a different journey had just begun. "You know," Samuel said, his voice warm and low, "I planned this trip a long time ago. Not for a vacation, but to find you." Elijah turned to him, surprised. "To find me? But how did you know I'd be on that flight?" Samuel smiled gently. "I followed your family ever since I learned about your grandfather. When I found out you and your father would be flying from Oak Ridge to Havenport, I booked a seat on the same flight. I don't believe in coincidences. This was meant to be." Elijah fell silent, feeling the weight behind Samuel's words. He turned to the vast sky outside, its deep blue stretching endlessly ahead, like a road waiting to be walked. Suddenly, Elijah's phone buzzed. A message from Aria. "Careful. Some guy is looking for you. Says he's a reporter, but gives off major creep vibes." Elijah's pulse quickened. He turned to Samuel. "What should we do?" Samuel thought for a moment, then said, "I think it's time you faced the world. But not alone. I'll be right beside you." Together, they stepped out of the secured area and into the main terminal. Almost instantly, a man holding a microphone and a camera rushed toward them. "Elijah Moore, can you tell us how you feel about the incident on the plane?" he asked, voice urgent. Elijah instinctively took a step back, but Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between the boy and the camera. "He won't be answering any questions right now," Samuel said firmly. "Please respect his privacy." The man frowned but didn't press. He hesitated, then slowly backed away. Samuel turned to Elijah. "You see? Sometimes all it takes is one person standing up, and everything shifts." Elijah nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Samuel beside him, he wouldn't have to walk it alone. Later, Elijah returned to the waiting room to find his father already there. Dr. Kenneth Moore stood near the table, holding a newspaper with a bold headline sprawled across the front page. "Teen slapped mid-flight. Veteran stands up as hero." He looked up, his gaze steady, softened by something unspoken. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Elijah nodded. "I'm okay, but I've changed." Kenneth stepped closer and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I always thought I had to protect you from the world by controlling it, but today you showed me that sometimes the best protection is letting you speak for yourself." Elijah looked into his father's weathered eyes, still harboring the quiet fears of a man who's seen too much and still worries more. "I wasn't alone. Not with you." not with the people who stood up for me. They embraced. No more words were needed. Sometimes, the most important things exist in silence. Meanwhile, in a small holding room at Havenport International Airport, Richard Whitmore sat motionless, his back against a cold wall. His tie hung loose, his once crisp white shirt now wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee from the scuffle earlier. The sterile glow of the overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his face. No longer the polished visage of a high-ranking executive, but the worn-out shell of a man starting to realize he had just lost everything. The door creaked open. A security officer entered with a blank expression, placing a tablet on the table. "You should see this," he said, then turned the screen around. The video was only 18 seconds long. The sharp clap of the slap rang out, haunting in its clarity. A young black boy struck across the face in the cramped cabin of an airplane. A flushed middle-aged man, his eyes burning with rage, his hand still suspended midair. Gasps filled the cabin, someone shouting, "He's just a kid." The caption below, CEO Richard Whitmore slaps black teen on flight. Racism or loss of control? The clip had gone viral within 2 hours of landing. On Twitter, hashtag Flight 2687 and hashtag Justice for Elijah had climbed into the national trending list. An anonymous account claiming to work at Whitmore and Carrington confirmed the man in the video was indeed Richard Whitmore. The outrage wasn't born of surprise. It was fueled by recognition. Another powerful man in a suit, caught in an act no decent society could accept. "You're facing a minimum 1-year no-fly order," the officer said as Richard stared at his own image frozen on the screen. "Possibly longer, depending on the investigation outcome. Law enforcement is waiting outside. They'll take your statement and allow you to contact legal counsel." Richard said nothing. He didn't need a lawyer to know the ground beneath him was already collapsing. Once a decision-maker, he was now a headline. His phone sat vibrating endlessly on the table. Emails from the board, urgent messages from his communications team, and a single text from his wife. "Richard, what is this? Elijah Moore? On a plane?" Elsewhere in the airport, Elijah sat on a plastic bench in the passenger area, surrounded by the dim hum of fluorescent lights and travelers flowing past, oblivious to what had happened. On his phone, the video played again and again, shared by hundreds of thousands, alongside messages of support, grief, and outrage. "I didn't choose this," Elijah said softly, eyes locked on the screen. Beside him, Samuel gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "No one chooses to be a victim, but sometimes you're chosen to make the world stop and listen." Elijah stepped out of the airport security headquarters with a storm of thoughts spinning in his chest. The Havenport sunset couldn't warm the chill running down his spine. Not from Richard's slap, but from everything that had followed. Back on that plane, all he'd wanted was to reach his science competition, present his project, maybe earn a scholarship. Now, the world felt massive, harsh, and unforgiving, a place where one misstep, one unprovoked strike, could slice through a person's life like a blade. Samuel walked silently beside him. They just finished their meeting with the airport police. Not long, but not easy either. Elijah had recounted everything in a tone so calm it unsettled the officer taking notes. Few could remain composed after an assault, let alone when they become the center of a nationwide firestorm. "You did well," Samuel said, gently resting a hand on Elijah's shoulder as the two of them stepped out into the airport parking lot. "Not because you stayed calm, but because you didn't let anyone else define who you are." Elijah looked at him, his eyes no longer burning with anger, only fatigue and a quiet depth born of understanding. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to carry all of this," he admitted. "I'm just a kid who wanted to be left alone." Samuel gave a sad smile. "Haven't we all felt that way? But it's in the moment we're backed into a corner that we learn how to stand tall." The word sank into Elijah's mind like a quiet echo. He thought of Aria's defiant eyes when she stood up for him, the calm strength in Naomi's voice as she protected what was right, the message from Sophie, his classmate from Oak Ridge, who reached out with a simple, "Saw the video. You didn't deserve that. Proud of you." Each small gesture of kindness, each unnamed act of courage, now wove together into a force that made him feel less alone. That night, In the quiet of a hotel near the airport, Elijah opened his laptop and watched the video again. Now with over 3 million views in just 18 hours. He saw his own face, stunned, hurt but unbroken. And behind him, Samuel, standing like a quiet wall between him and injustice. Elijah didn't repost the clip. He didn't respond to the hate-filled comments about Richard or the praises calling him a hero. Instead, he opened a new document and began typing his college application essay to MIT, not just about his science project, but about the journey he'd just endured. Justice, he typed slowly, isn't just what happens in a courtroom. It's every time we choose not to bow to injustice, even when no one's watching. The next morning in Oak Ridge, Elijah stood on the upper floor of the hotel, looking down at the never-ending stream of traffic that pulsed through the city. In his hand was his phone, screen lit up with an unsent message. "Thank you for standing up. I'll never forget it." Samuel had never asked for anything. He never demanded recognition. What he gave was an act, quiet, simple, but one that forever altered Elijah's understanding of courage. That slap, of course, was unjust, but what lingered wasn't rage. It was a lesson that justice doesn't always arrive in the form of judges or lawyers. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a stranger willing to rise when no one else would. Elijah realized that justice isn't just being protected. It's about learning to speak out for others, like Arya did, like Samuel did. And soon, like he would, whether in a classroom, a lab, or any space where someone is diminished because of their skin or their name. That day, Elijah wasn't just a boy who got slapped on a plane. He became the first ripple in a wave of change, not because he was stronger than anyone else, but because he chose not to step back. And somewhere in that vast city, Samuel smiled. At last, he had kept his promise, not just to the past, but to the future.